What an interesting group of speakers. I just want to say that to everybody who presented, and also very timely, because I think each one is underlying an issue that it's not just an issue, it's a crisis. And yet there is a sense of a lack of urgency in many places. And these papers really remind us of the incredible urgency of the issue of the climate crisis, but also if and how we transition economies has enormous implications. And while this debate has been going on for some years, there's been a shift. So I'm going to try and just pull out a few themes from these papers and then open up the floor. So the issue strikes me across all 5 papers is the notion of the underlying relationship between capitalism and the transition to whether it's a just transition or maybe it's not a just transition. And so it's very much girded by an understanding of capitalism and how capitalism shapes issues and transitions in economies, and how often it aligns issues of social justice as soon as there is, whether it be an urgent economic or in this case, an environmental crisis, the social justice issues seem to, in many instances, disappear. What's wonderful about these cases is that you see these themes emerging in slightly different ways. So I think what also these papers do, though, is they focus us to re-ask those questions about how do we put the just back in the just transition? How do we consider that? And who has the role? Who is responsible and has the capacity and power to do so? And so these papers also require that, I think in the last year in particular, maybe even the last 5, we've seen a real shift from an overall transition to a real focus, and I can't remember which papers said that one, really on energy transitions. There's been a real narrowing of the scope of what's meant by a just transition. And yet, when we look at the construction industry, we look at the regional economies, it's far more than energy. It's agriculture, it's construction, and that's where the circular economy is an interesting concept to use in understanding all the pieces, but also the levels of each of those industries. So I think these papers refocus us on the notion of what is sustainable development at a time of a climate crisis, but also makes us focus again on decent work and who gets represented in the transition process. And I think that's incredibly important. Who drives the process and who's represented? So that raised to me in all of these papers the question of what is the role of the state and the role of capital. And in fact, and then it raises questions about the capacity of the state. And I think, Karen, your piece on, and also Darren, well, actually, all of them have a regional element, with the exception of Denmark, national, but nonetheless, many of them have regional. Does the state have the capacity? Has it lost the capacity as a result of decades of neoliberalism to, in fact, play the kind of role that maybe it might aspire, but maybe it's lost even the aspiration to play? And therefore, I think, where are decisions being made about the transition? Who is making those decisions? And who has the power to influence those decisions? And I think each of these papers when you take them together, they start providing us with some important answers, but also important questions. Let me turn to labor, because the big underlying question is, where does labor fit in this process? And labor is more complex than that monolith called labor. As many of you pointed out, the groups of labor that may be driving or supporting or active in the Denmark transition may not represent, as Karen said, all the sectors of labor that may be impacted. In other words, there is a subgroup of labor that is more impacted by greening. The care economy may be will be less impacted than the construction or by mining. But nonetheless, who has a say in greening is actually an impact on the entire economy and the entire workforce. And the risk, I think, what I found interesting is you get threads of the risk that some groups of workers may have a voice, others won't. but also workers will be unequally affected. And I was really intrigued by your weaving in the notion of contracting out, and because that means you kind of offload the costs of that greening onto groups of workers that are already more vulnerable, similarly in the caring economy. So I think those are very, very important questions. And the question is whether unions stay in a reactive mode or they begin to lead the change, but what does that look like? And finally, I would ask two more questions which are raised by these, but I think are important. Who defines the scope of the transition, of that just transition, and who benefits from the transition, and who pays the price? Those are the big questions, which in capitalism, there have always been seen to be winners and losers. And the danger here is there will be bigger winners and losers. Is it corporations, governments? Is it unions? Is it regions? And where do the other groups fit who aren't represented by any of these groups? Because there are many, many groups who will be impacted by the transition who have no representation. Where is their voice and how do they get represented? Finally, how do we evaluate success? And how do we understand success and progress? Because if, as John was saying, how quickly we're moving towards climate crisis, the question is, how do we, not only what we aspire for, but we have to be able to measure success in order to keep pushing. Otherwise, we keep going like a hamster in a wheel because we don't know whether we've made progress or not. So somewhere we need to figure out, how do we know when we've made a step forward so that we can go that next step? And I'd be interested, and that's not just economic measures, as was said by many, but it includes social, environmental, regional, and of course, class as well. So I end on that, but I just want to say fascinating. It's made me kind of think about some work I've been trying to do on the auto parts sector, but very, very interesting. And I'm really curious to hear about the discussion, comments and so on. So hope that helps.